And welcome to what I believe might be a monumentally important retrospective of the 2008 great financial crisis with some amazing people that provided incredible information for our program and many other outlets, across the span of media. But for our work, particularly that we're now offering to the world for free, which you can find at www.thecon.tv. Well, we started off this week, of course, with the annual call to never forget 9/11 and everything that comes with 9/11, particularly a lot of the question marks that a lot of people are still awfully divided about. And as it relates to another 9/11 like event, not to be too literal in the comparison, but in terms of a tragedy that had immense toll on the American people, was, of course, the 2008 great financial crisis. And in the spirit of never forgetting, what we continue to do and what we've done all along is actually try to stimulate an understanding of what actually took place, rather than call for never forget, because nobody knows what exactly took place to begin with on a mass level. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I want to introduce my guest first, and then I'm going to ask for some opening comments. Richard Bowen, former underwriter at Citigroup, senior player there, very well known to a lot of people around this country in terms of his heroic work, in terms of an awareness of introspection of everything that was happening at Citigroup. Mark Gant, the former Attorney General of Ohio, in private practice now, but an expert in all things what created the great financial crisis, and being really the only guy that I happenstanced across that pulled off the only RICO conviction in the entire country for something that it appeared that our entire financial system was engaged with. Paul Pelletier, a veteran of the Department of Justice, former director of investigations, white collar investigations, involved with unbelievably important aspects of American law enforcement, particularly as it relates to white collar fraud. In fact, also mentioned a lot of very important media scenarios, including the Fenton files with the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, as well as being an expert in Alex Gibney's The Crime of the Century and more. And then, of course, William K. Black, former regulator and criminologist, a gentleman best known for his work as general counsel of Office of Thrift Supervision during savings and loan crisis and the Keating Five scandal. And then ultimately, decades and decades of expertise that continues to bring us insights and truths into what seems to be a mystery to tens of millions of Americans that hopefully we're going to penetrate with this particular revelation in context to what happened in the 2008 great financial crisis and how those lessons relate to everything we're in the midst of now. So just a couple of opening statements. I'm going to start with Bill. Bill, obviously, been there, done that, and yet it must feel like Groundhog Day. A lot of things never change. Can you give us some kind of opening thoughts about perspective of the 2008 great financial crisis?
Sure. A clarification. I appreciate the promotion, but I was litigation director of the agency as opposed to its general counsel. This is a group of folks that has succeeded. And we succeeded because we are parts of teams with leadership that wanted to succeed and was willing to bear the political cost of succeeding. We knew how to deal with the great financial crisis. We had seen the schemes before. We had successfully prosecuted. We had successfully taken enforcement actions. We had successfully re-regulated the industry. Ultimately, each of us was also prevented from fully succeeding. In the case of Mark, he can tell you about the incredible efforts of the federal banking regulators to prevent the states from protecting us from not just the fraudsters, but the predators that drove the great financial crisis. In the case of Richard Bowen, he got it dead right at Citi. And it isn't just that they didn't listen to him. Richard is here because Richard is many years later, as is his counterpart, Michael Winston, unemployable in the US financial industry because he got it right. And because every CEO knows he would continue to get it right. And that's dangerous to CEOs who are doing bad things. Paul was a leader in the prosecutorial efforts. And the prosecutorial efforts didn't simply involve the savings and loan debacle and the banking crisis that overlapped in the 1980s and the 1990s. That success in prosecuting some of the most elite CEOs in America continued into the Enron era. Today, we get financial crises in the equivalent of about a 15-mile-an-hour wind in which our banks threaten to topple. I'm talking about those of us that dealt with the banking side of it, we dealt with the largest bubble in the history of the financial bubble in the history of the world that drove the great financial crisis. The second largest bubble in the world that was important to the Enron era crisis, the dot-com bubble and such. There was no such massive bubble that blew up and led to incredible instability in our banking system just months ago. And you can see the same thing building up in crypto. So it's got a message that is both incredibly awful in that we know how to succeed and we've been prevented from succeeding, but optimistic. We can succeed. It needs people that have the will. And then we need to actually learn the right lessons from what worked and what failed. Instead, we're replicating and even doubling down on failure. Thank you.
Paul, what do you think about the kind of perspective of this grand arc?
First of all, thanks for having me on, Patrick. Thanks for doing this. And thanks to everybody on this panel. And the people on this panel are, I believe, as Bill Black said, true heroes, present company excluded, but true heroes in this fight that you're putting keeping the bright light on. So my perspective is a little bit different than Bill's. I, of course, look at it from the failures of the Department of Justice, how those have impacted where we are now, the failures of the judicial system as a whole, as it relates to allowing this two-tier system of justice that we have, where the elites seem to get off all the time, and three, the political vacuum or um, um, the political temperature that existed at the time that let this continue to go on and continue to go on today. So, as I look at it from those three perspectives, I look at where we are today versus where we were back in 2008. I, I feel not much has changed, but we've seen what our failure to do to tackle the problems of the great financial crisis may have borne. The first and most obvious example is on the political front. I believe that failure to deal with the great financial crisis gave birth to Donald Trump. I think that Donald Trump is not a political party, it's an ideology and a movement that was created by sort of um, people being unsatisfied with the political system that was not addressing their needs for years. And when the Obama administration finally didn't address them, I believe that's what gave at least the opportunity for this MAGA movement to fester and ultimately blossom. And we're still dealing with that today. So I feel that that's one of the fallouts. On the on the Department of Justice front, sort of the front where the rubber hits the road prosecuting these people, I don't see, as Bill just alluded to, I don't see much change at all. I don't see, we have 93 U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice. And when we look out there and we look at what's being done on a national level to attack this two-tiered system of justice where the elite aren't prosecuted for elite crimes, I don't see much of a change. I don't see any leadership. I see words, but we don't see real action. Of course, in the Trump prosecutions, we see a lot of energy devoted towards prosecuting sort of these Trumpian crimes that almost destroyed our democracy. But so we see what the department is capable of doing if they put their minds to it. But we don't. I haven't seen any concerted act, any, as we discussed before, any Manhattan Project to deal with these type of crimes, which haven't gone away and which are going to persist, and really are a poison that's going to ultimately affect our economy again. And then finally, I look at the corruption of the judicial branch that's most evident by the billionaire class impacting and affecting our Supreme Court, right? So we have Ginny and Clarence Thomas Inc. We have Sam Alito Inc. And we see that the impact that the billionaire class has on the direct contact and the direct impact that they have on our Supreme Court. And now we can see, which we couldn't see so easily before, why the elite, the billionaire, the big business in America is treated differently. And we can see better evidence of why that's happening. So I think that the fallout in the optics that we have is even greater now, but I don't see anything being done on any of those three levels to actually tamp down the problem.
Boy, am I glad you touched upon a Manhattan-like project to get this right, and we'll circle back to what that might look like in a moment. But I want to turn continuing thoughts to you, Mr. Dan.
A little angry with Paul because he stole most of what I was going to say, and we did not talk before this, and we haven't talked in probably a couple of years before this meeting. But we live in the same country and we're observing the same things. You know, I come from I have a kind of unique perspective in this group because I was a political office holder, or as I like to say, I'm now a recovering politician. And so I, from the political perspective as well as from the legal perspective, and the intersection of those two things. Let me just amplify a little bit of what Paul said. We've had the Sacklers commit mass murder in this country, billionaire family of people who became addicted to the opioids that they were promoting. And not only are they going to avoid criminal liability, or have so far avoided criminal liability for those deaths, but they're going to be able to keep $1 billion or $2 billion in their pocket at the end of the day. And I have no doubt that the billionaire friends of the members of the Supreme Court that now have the issue of the Sacklers' ultimate liability in their hands are whispering the appropriate things in their ears, because there, but for the grace of God, go those other billionaires who need to look out for each other and themselves. We had a scandal in Ohio, the largest political corruption scandal in the history of the state. The state speaker of the House, Larry Householder, has been sentenced to 20 years in jail. One of his co-conspirators has been sentenced to 5 years in jail. Despite the fact that there are 2 U.S. attorneys and 3 county prosecutors who have the full ability to prosecute the executives of First Energy who bribed I'm not just guessing. A jury has decided that these First Energy executives bribed the Ohio legislature into not just doing what they want, but to actually getting Ohio citizens to pay for some of their sunk costs in their electric production and nuclear power plants. That we have no business doing. And by the way, we can't yet repeal that. It's still law in Ohio. The corrupt outcome of the court determined political corruption that went on. We see we see now the private equity and hedge funds raping public pension systems. The kind of the last safe, the last group of people in the country of working class Americans that have retirement that was relatively safe were public employees and teachers, and the Wall Street folks have figured their way in there. And the reason nobody's screaming about it is because along the way they purchased all the newspapers in Ohio, who are all owned by the same hedge funds that are entering into secret deals with results that are really unascertainable, not just by the public, but even by the investment officials at the public pension funds. I'm very familiar with what's going on in Ohio, but this is going on in Kentucky. It's going on in Pennsylvania. It's going on across Rhode Island, and we're involved in Chicago with the Chicago police pension. No transparency, no accountability, and they tell the funds what results they're getting, but they're paying huge fees and management fees long before any money ever gets returned to the pension funds. And meanwhile, those workers are doing without cost of living increases in their pensions. And so, retired. There's 2 million or almost 3 million Ohio participants in the public pension system, and it's and this outrage goes on, and nobody's willing to take a look under the hood at what's going on, because, as Paul said, there's a two-tiered system of justice. Lots of the folks that are dealing fentanyl are in jail. Lots of small-time fraudsters are in jail. Poor Larry Householder, not poor Larry Householder. He was a corrupt guy. He'll be in jail. The House Speaker, but until you start putting the bribers in jail, all you do in corporate America is encourage the same conduct that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Because until these guys have to take off their $1,000 suits and put on orange jumpsuits, nothing is going to change. And I most agree with Paul of all the things he said about the fact that this launched the career of Donald Trump. I like to say I spent a lot of time in the Mahoning Valley, which is an old steel town in northeastern Ohio, where I lived for 20 years and raised my family. And the reason that people in Ohio in that part of Ohio voted for Donald Trump in such numbers is because there was nobody more despicable on the ballot. They just want a pox on these people's houses. And I understand why they do, because they are on the short end. They're the ones that ended up losing their homes. They're the one. I can't tell you the number of in my current law practice now, we sue banks and mortgage companies, and I can't tell you the number of my clients that marched out to Iowa and New Hampshire on a volunteer basis to help Donald Trump in 2016, because they were, one, they didn't have a place to live, so it made it easier for them to be free to do that. And two, but these are people that had small businesses. These are people that were really people in the minority community who were aggressively targeted. And we've learned nothing. I mean, this year alone, I'm taking the lead in a lawsuit against Wells Fargo. 700. They turned down 70% of African American applicants for refinancing when the interest rates were at 3%, and only turned down 41% of non-African American applicants. 750,000 African American families who aren't going to share in the American dream, who aren't benefiting from the nice 3% interest rates that probably many of us on this call are enjoying, because we had the access to credit that people didn't have, or those folks didn't have. We just sued Bank of America, who just duplicated what Wells Fargo did by creating fake accounts, by creating incentives for their employees to open fake checking and credit card accounts for literally thousands of people. They've already been fined by the CFPB. But that was only $1 million fine. $100 million fine. And when I say only, in the numbers of the profit schemes of Wells Fargo and in Bank of America, despite paying out billions and billions and billions in Chase and all the other big banks, billions of dollars, they're still profitable. They're still issuing dividends. They're still buying back their stock, which is, I could go on and on with the outrages that, or the reasons that people are so frustrated and outraged. And unfortunately, to a large extent, the mainstream Democratic Party's become, the Republican Party's gone nuts, and the Democratic Party has aligned with this business leadership in a way that is very unappealing to people in our state and people, working class people around the country. And Sherrod Brown, to the extent that anybody's a bit of an exception to that, Sherrod is actually I think he actually knows what's wrong, but he has not had the ability or the courage to see through those changes that needed to be made and to demand those prosecutions take place in a way that I think he'll be in great danger when he's up for re-election next year in Ohio. And so the guy that comes closest to doing the right thing still can't seem to pull the trigger and actually do the right thing with this stuff. And it becomes it's a very frustrating thing to watch. I'm now in the business. When I used to try to save all the starfish, as all of you did, now I'm in the business of saving one starfish at a time with my clients, and that's gratifying and fulfilling and great for those people that happen to fall into my office or have a chance. But I can only help so many people at a time. So that's the frustration. That's the lessons that weren't learned. And I could go on, and I won't, because we don't have that kind of time. But Paul, thank you for raising that point. I think that's why we all are dealing with Trump, and we know they know how to do it, because you're right, they're doing it with Trump, and they did it with the politicians, but they can't seem to pull the trigger when it comes to the business executives.
Well, and Dick, there's a lot of stuff that was an intersection with your story. I'll just comment on a couple as kind of a segue into how you're seeing this whole thing. Obviously, pensioners, that you were in an incredible position you've done things that nobody else did at the level you did to try to prevent the carnage that happened downstream for all the things you discovered. But then also, the other aspect of it was you were always warning us of the banks having too much power. That was always kind of your line. And I'm wondering, how you're feeling, given what you just heard and everything that you've had to endure, really, since the collapse.
Well, oh gosh, I'm getting all worked up again, just getting back into this. What I saw at Citigroup, and this was not solely at Citigroup, this was going on at most of the banking companies. Specifically, they were buying mortgages that did not meet any real policy criteria, and then they were turning them around and they were selling them to mortgage securitizations and giving the representations that these were good mortgages. And these, we're talking billions, we were talking easily $90 billion annually of these mortgages. And these mortgages then went into pension funds. They went into investments around the country. I quite frankly started screaming about it as soon as I discovered it. And I screamed about it internally for a year and a half. And finally, I went to the board of directors, to Robert Rubin, and to the executive officers. And they basically covered it up. They lied on their certification on their Sarbanes-Oxley that their internal controls were effective, and they wound up throwing me out. And I went to the SEC. That was the first of many government cover-ups that took place. I gave them over 1,000 pages of documents showing the massive fraud that was going on within Citigroup. And these young prosecutors in their enforcement division, they got really excited. And then we had the bailouts of the banks, the TARP bailouts, and Citigroup was bailed out to the tune of $500 billion in capital and toxic asset guarantees. Plus, we later found out another $2.5 trillion of secret low interest loans by the Federal Reserve. And again, that was the first of several cover ups that actually occurred at our government agencies. You know, thanks to, in the earlier financial crisis, Bill Black and his being instrumental in prosecuting banking and executive officers in that crisis. I think we prosecuted and they convicted over with over 1,000 over 1,000.
Over 1,700 in the savings and loan industry and over 3,000 in the banking industry.
And then in this last financial crisis, we prosecuted what? Zero, Bill?
Essentially zero people that had any real decision-making authority. None of the elites that we were quite correctly focusing on.
The only lesson that has been learned by banking coming out of the financial crisis is there will not be any accountability, pure and simple. And that has seeded, I'm convinced, a large part of the ongoing behavior that we're seeing today. So, I'll try to settle down here, but this is. And I get so frustrated because we are talking about our government and our government being particular about who they're going to hold accountable for what, and that is largely influenced by the economic forces in the community, as has been pointed out.
The thing that I recall from both Paul and Bill was just how unique and important you were as a whistleblower to the government case in context of everything else. But we all know what the aftermath is. And I think I'd just like to get some leadership and thoughts from Bill and Paul initially on that, and just we'll see where the conversation goes from there.
Okay, so Paul, I like Mark, agree with each of those 3 points. And it's a cynical age, I know, but in fact, we had no discussions in advance of this. To pick up on what Mark said, we just all live in the same reality. And we're actually trying to deal with the reality as opposed to these bizarre, fictions that people create, like shining the flashlight and having the cat chase the flashlight all over the room, away from what the elites are doing. Couple of things out of what we know as white collar criminologists, right? So there's this famous saying, if you're an economist, it's famous. I'll paraphrase it by Bastiat. When plunder becomes a way of life for elites in society, they create laws that authorize it and a moral code that glorifies it. And in the modern era where, I used to always say that the highest return on assets for banking was a political contribution, right? But now, as Paul has pointed out, it's actually cheaper just to buy the Supreme Court, right? There are far fewer of them. And you can do it in a much more opaque manner. It's the Supreme Court that said money is speech, and it's okay because the publicity will counter the bad effects. And then a few years later said, well, actually, dark money is just fine. We don't need any of that Brandeisian stuff, right? That's sunlight is the best disinfectant type of thing. We don't need no stinking transparency in these systems. So The Bible, God forbid, says it, all those that doeth evil hateth the light. That is why they hate whistleblowers, because whistleblowers shine the light and they show a path for the prosecutors. And it is, as Paul has said, because we won't go through the mechanics, I think, in this talk, but the Supreme Court has made it extraordinarily difficult not just to prosecute elite felons from corporate world, it has made it extraordinarily difficult to convict politicians of corruption. Nowadays, you almost have to say, hi, I am giving you a bribe. This bribe is contingent on you doing the following quid pro quo, which is a bad thing and will make you personally wealthy. Do you agree that this is a bribe, sir? Oh, yes, I agree it's a bribe, right? That's where the Supreme Court is.
Well, that's so, and they did that in Ohio, and they did it by text message. But yet, the guy on the other end of the text message is playing golf in Florida right now.
Yeah. So again, and I'll leave with one other takeaway from white collar criminology: the whole debate about left, right type of stuff, government, private sector, misses the point. If you are an elite CEO, the billionaire class, you create a predatory network. And that predatory network is going to have media, as Mark pointed out, because, again, you prevent the transparency. It's going to have the prominent politicians. It's going to have government leaders in agencies as well. They'll put people in charge whose mission is to destroy the effectiveness of the agency. And it will have plentiful private sector folks. The auditors will give clean opinions to toxic stuff. The credit rating agencies will give AAA to toxic securities. And the result we are seeing now is you don't have to even be good at fraud, right? You can be Elizabeth Holmes and never produce a single product that works. And your company can be valued at roughly $9 billion. You can be Sam Bankman-Fried and openly describe what you're doing as a Ponzi scheme. And you can take, at least preliminarily, somewhere in the order of $6 to $12 billion, right? They're not very good at these frauds. That means we're catching, again, the stupid ones, the really arrogant, stupid ones. And in case of Trump, that still took 40 years before there was a serious prosecution. Everything else, he's one of the most litigious people in the world. So there are literally over 1,000 suits in which he's either defendant or plaintiff, but nobody pushed them home, and then you just settle, right? And you get no deterrence, you get no incapacitation, you get none of the things that everybody says you need to prevent this from happening. And so when it gets really, really bad, it's called a Gresham's dynamic. A Gresham's dynamic is when you gain a competitive advantage by cheating, which is we're seeing all over the place. And in that case, bad ethics will drive good ethics out of the marketplace. And I'm paraphrasing a Nobel Prize winner in economics and all of white collar criminology finding. So we know what's going wrong. We're all seeing the same world, but not only is it not being countered, not being fixed, the world is being made more, we would say, criminogenic every day by these powerful predatory networks. And unless and until we take the country back to the rule of law for everybody, disaster awaits.
Paul, could you chime in?
Yeah, well, to pick up on where Bill was, I teach corruption in law school and anti-corruption actually. So, Not so sure how the students pick it up, but anyway, it's most corruption starts very small, and the reason why it grows and becomes a huge or significant problem is because it's unaddressed. People don't hold people accountable, and it goes on and gets bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where then it becomes a conflagration. So, and that's not a unique problem. We've known that's been going on for years. We know also from our experience in the Department of Justice, from the Bank Fraud Task Force, the Enron Task Force, that it that these types of crimes need a lot of attention. They need a lot of attention by the regulators. They need a lot of attention by the criminal prosecutors and criminal investigators. We know that didn't happen during the great financial crisis. That's not a mystery. Everybody knows it. But so now we have the Biden administration, the Biden Department of Justice. So you would think, wow, the lesson has been taught. Now they're going to get their act together. They're going to start training people actively on how to actually deal with these crimes. They're actually going to put task forces together. They're actually going to do something about that. And of course, we see none of that. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why? Why is anybody tackling this problem? Why isn't anybody admitting within the Department of Justice or within the bank regulators? Why isn't anybody admitting there's a problem that needs to be addressed? There is, in fact, a two-tier system of justice that needs to be addressed. And I've come to the conclusion, I may be wrong, but I've come to the conclusion that in order to become in the leadership of whether it be the Republican elite when Republicans are elected, or a Democratic elite when the Democrats elected, in order to get in the leadership of the Department of Justice or anywhere else, you have to be a member of the club, right? And the people that are on the ground fighting, making a nuisance of themselves, never become members of these clubs. So the members of the clubs are people who are typically go along, get along people, and those people who are members of the elite leadership in the Department of Justice when Obama was elected, that did nothing about the great financial crisis. Many of them have found their way into the Department of Justice under the Biden administration. So what I want to say is, I don't know how to change that dynamic, but I will say until you put a team of people together to admit where you've gone wrong, to admit all of these problems, and to recognize change needs to happen, and teams need to be built, and task force need to be constructed, and whistleblowers like Dick need to be listened to. And when they talk, their information needs to be pushed out through the entire task force so that it can't be silenced. So it has to be addressed. Until you understand that and change the dynamic, nothing's ever going to happen. At least that's my perspective.
Well, again, going back to what you talked about in terms of let's call it the Manhattan-like project to deal with corruption, and that's what this is. Guys, this isn't the United States. I'm just a regular guy. You guys are all the top level experts and the people that have really done the work that we, the people, expect and would just depend on, quite frankly. But unfortunately, you guys are the exception, not the rule. And Paul, going back to your sort of uh, architecture, if you will, given who the people are on this call, can you give us a little insight into what is it going to take? I mean, and I guess I'll just proffer this really quick. I mean, Donald Trump is being blamed as having defrauded the United States using racketeering. What did Wall Street do again? Maybe in the context of your answer, give us that sort of comparison, and then maybe if everybody could chime in on that.
Well, just in 2 seconds, it's going to take what it's always taken in the past: a crisis and leadership, and effective leadership that understands the nature of the problem and understands how to build a team to deal with it. Because it seems to be the only thing that is a change agent. And in my experience, in my 30 years in the Department of Justice, but I defer to everyone else for their views. I don't have a rosy or optimistic view because I spend a lot of time writing about like you said, Manhattan projects and changing the dynamic so we can get ahead of the curve, so we can start at least catching up with the bad guys and addressing the schemes that are out there today. And I see zero, at least public facing, zero attempt to do that. So that's where I am.
Mark, do you have some thoughts? I mean, I thought your opening was pretty comprehensive, but I mean, obviously, you were the only guy that nailed a regional, which was a large racketeering enterprise, but that was the entirety of what Wall Street was involved with. And now we're seeing Bonnie Willis and what seems to be like Bill always said to us, look, the great financial crisis was child's play compared to, quite frankly, the S&L crisis in terms of actually what you had to do to be able to get the prosecution. This thing is just almost too hard to understand that this is even a possibility.
Yeah, I don't. The culture is so broken in the Justice Department and in the local. Look, this goes to local law enforcement as well. I mean there are plenty of resources being devoted to much less serious crimes and crimes of much less consequence in every municipality in the country. And the same thing at the federal level. And until that culture changes, Merrick Garland is exactly what Paul described. He's a creature of the establishment, and without whose first duty and job is to protect all the people that he plays bridge with. And so until there's somebody and Trump, unfortunately, despite the fact that he may have been elected, in my view, for some of the right reasons, was the absolute wrong guy because he was incapable of or uninterested in actually rectifying it. Hostile to, well, in fact, and he actually put people into these agencies that were even worse than the establishment guys who were literally, as sport, trying to dissolve them and undermine their capabilities, more for the fun of it than for any goal. It was just bizarre. But there's got to be, if that passion can be directed to somebody, a leader, and unfortunately in America we elect people, not parties, and it's very different than most democracies in the world. And so, but if we could get to the point where somebody steps forward that understands that this, Rome is starting to burn, that our civilization and our democracy will collapse ultimately under the weight of the discontent of the vast majority of people in this country, and the fact that they have started to figure out just how fucked they are in light of the current system.
Let me tell you something about how the prosecutions actually did occur, right? So this is during the Reagan and then the first Bush administration. Those administrations were extremely hostile to the idea of prosecuting. The Justice Department was not a leader in seeking prosecutions. So it's a deliberate strategy. This is an era when criminal referrals had just been created on a standardized basis in the banking regulatory agencies. We made public every month the number of criminal referrals we had made. And this pretty soon, over the course of 6 years, became over 30,000 criminal referrals. And so every month in the the Washington Post, there was a story. There are X thousands of criminal referrals and virtually no prosecutions. What the hell's going on? Right? And we were getting killed by political contributions. It isn't just that the Reagan-Bush administrations were not supporting us in the effort to prosecute. The worst fraudster in America, Charles Keating, folks older enough will remember that name, got President Reagan to agree to appoint a majority of members to run our federal agency, chosen by Charles Keating. for the express purpose of shutting us down. The House of Representatives, a majority of the House, at the instance of Charles Keating, co-sponsored a resolution calling on us to stop the re-regulation of the industry. And that was not just a majority of the House of Representatives. Think of the lobbying task of Keating pulling that off. That was the entire senior leadership of both the Democrats and the Republicans in the House, including what would become one of the most powerful speakers in America, Jim Wright, right? That's what they did. When later, after we had gotten prosecutions, we brought an action, administrative enforcement action, against the son of the sitting president of the United States. The general counsel of the FDIC, a senior banking regulator, called over to the head of our agency and tried to get him to take the enforcement action away from our agency so that it could be killed. Right? These kinds of interventions are going to occur all the time. Ultimately, it was bringing the prosecutions, bringing the civil actions, bringing the enforcement actions in plain English, and having me spend thousands of hours with reporters to get across what is it we're actually saying in plain English, that a revulsion occurred in the public. And they said, we're paying for all this crap. And suddenly the politicians who received these contributions, which are effectively bribes, as soon as we would bring the civil or the criminal action, they would rush to return the money. The greatest power had become a liability, a sort of a jujitsu type move. But none of that, there's not, military analogies are terrible. There's never going to be a decisive battle in which you end fraud and corruption and, elite abuses, right? Every generation has to do this, however imperfectly they can do it. But they got rid of the criminal referrals. And the Obama administration, and now, of course, the Trump and the current President Biden, have never even reinstated the criminal referral process within the agency. And here was their logic, obviously in scare quotes. From two of the agencies actually said this publicly. Why would we make criminal referrals? That's what the bank is supposed to do. You go, I don't think the bank's going to make a criminal referral against the CEO. Something just makes me think this. I'll just leave you with this obvious series of questions. Go back to the primary battle for the Democratic nomination between Hillary Clinton and Obama. Everybody knew Hillary was going to win. She's way out front. The Clintons are historically incredibly tied to big finance and servile to big finance. At that juncture, Obama was a freshman senator who had the highest progressive rating on his votes of any member of Congress. And somehow he ended up with a majority of the political contributions, a very substantial majority of the political contributions from the finance industry. Somebody had to go to the billionaires running the biggest banks and say, this guy is the right choice and will deliver for us. That's the only way that happens. And Paul can tell you the results from the inside, and Chris Swecker can tell you the results from the inside. Chris Swecker has told us, again, our tiny little agency in a vastly tinier crisis makes over 30,000 criminal referrals. All of the federal banking regulatory agencies, according to Chris, his best memory is 6 criminal referrals.
Well, and Dick, it's kind of ironic that Bill had made that statement because that's exactly what you did as an insider, really trying to do everything you possibly could to reveal all of the information that you had with one of the largest criminal campaigns in history. And, I guess the last question goes to you, Dick, in this whole process, because if Elizabeth Warren and Sherrod Brown were in front of all of you guys right now, given everything that you know and everything that you've been through and everything that they're going to reflect upon, with this retrospective, for me, when I hear again, 9/11, never forget. But then we never talk about what exactly is going on. And there's way too many questions to go into. But the bottom line is the 2008 great financial crisis to the general public is not infinitum. And yet most of the answers are right here on this panel. What would you say and what would you want to present to both Sherrod Brown and Miss Elizabeth Warren, given what they seem to have missed?
There is entirely too much economic resources that are consolidated in the banking system, particularly in the largest banks. We passed Dodd-Frank to try to eliminate a lot of the influence of the large banks. And as a result, we now have, Dodd-Frank was basically neutered by a lot of the regulatory side.
And by Dodd and Frank.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And we now, are at an all-time high with regard to the economic resources that are controlled by them. And they control everything, including our government, including the regulators. And quite frankly, and I've said this before, if you're going to do something effectively, you really do need to break up the banks. That was what we attempted to do. Well, they originally attempted to do it after the investigations following the Great Depression, right? When we passed Glass-Steagall, and that gave us relative economic stability for close to 50 years until we got into the 1980s, and we wound up deregulating and appealing Glass-Steagall. Now, I'm not specifically calling for Glass-Steagall, but if this country is going to do something fundamental that is going to restore some power and some true individual influence in this country going forward, we've got to diminish the power that the banks have. That's where I come from.
Any following closing comments from you guys?
Yeah, at least three of us have taught in universities or law schools. Mark, have you also?
No, I haven't had I'm not ready to retire yet.
Yeah, thanks. Let me tell you what you would be taught in economics today, in a conventional economic program. I'm going to paraphrase, but it's pretty darn close to an exact quotation. One of the top economists in the one of the regional feds says, when it comes to looking at abuses, economics teaches us that power is a naive explanation. So they're taught that you're not a good economist if you even inquire about power. That's how bad the academy is in the field of economics.
Paul, Mark, are you guys good or anything else to add at the moment? It feels like we could go forever, but I know that we're going to hard stop here in a couple of minutes.
Right. Well, we should do this more often. I'm feeling reinvigorated. I'm going to go out and sue. I'm going to go out and sue somebody after this. I think.
Well, I'll finish up. First of all, that's a great idea. I hope we can do this, moving forward because there is so much to cover. But I'll just say, from our perspective, thank you for everything that you brought to our project, The Con. Again, it's available at www.thecon.tv. But, again, just to kind of push out of this, as we heard today, everybody knows that Donald Trump was the consequence. And if we don't get this thing under control, it seemingly can even go from bad to worse. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for participating, and we'll look forward to the next conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks all.